Hi, so we are looking at Symbiosis, which is Key Area 5 from Sustainability and Interdependence Unit. Okay, so symbiosis is the key area, and it is obviously a key term, but it's used incorrectly quite often. Okay, so symbiosis is a general term for organisms that live together, and what they mean by living together, we have these keywords in this one. So we are looking at organisms which have co-evolved. That means that as one has evolved, that has created selective pressures for the other one, which has created selective pressures back. So there's a kind of back and forwards to create a kind of closer and closer association, and that's what we mean by an intimate association. There are organisms which have co-evolved so closely and so intimately that they are now completely dependent on each other. So you will have like a particular flower that has only one pollinator, one particular insect or bird that pollinates it and nothing else. So if one of them was to be wiped out, it would have a huge impact on the other. Okay. So there's different forms of symbiosis, and this is why I'm saying that you often get it stated incorrectly. Okay, what we mean by symbiosis is running through a pretty horrible range, because we start with parasitism. So what we mean by that is you have two organisms in close association, but one of them is doing well out of this and one of them is not. Okay, and then in the middle, and it's actually really difficult to find one in the middle that does this, you can get one where one of the organisms is benefiting and the other one neither up nor down. Okay, and this is the term that people use when, or should use, but don't. They use the term symbiosis. Mutualism is where both of the organisms that are involved in this relationship get something out of it. So they're both positively part of in the relationship. So a lot of people say, oh, there's a total symbiosis here, but really what they should say is it's mutualism. It is symbiosis, but symbiosis could be parasitism. So you have to be careful if you understand the terms. So a closer look at parasitism. So you need to know a few key terms for this one. So what we mean by this is that the parasite benefits. Okay, so that could be all sorts of things, but energy and nutrients is the main thing we're looking at here. And the other organism involved, which is called the host, is harmed. Okay, so if we want to show this, we just use pluses and minuses. So a plus/minus means that one is benefited, one is harmed. So if you see that, you know that you have parasitism, and the one that's a plus, you go, that's the parasite. The one that's a minus, you go, that's the host. Okay, so for example, and try not to scratch your head right now. Okay, so we also try to describe parasitism a little bit better, because basically every single living thing we've found has parasites. So we have endoparasites that live on the inside of their hosts. We have ectoparasites that live on the outside of their hosts. Now the only place that you've seen endo has been endotherm, which is where we had our internal temperatures are kept the same, so maybe that's okay for getting that one. And ecto you wouldn't have heard, we've not used that before, so that's on the outside. And then we can also say whether a parasite is obligate, that means obliged to be a parasite. Now what that means is that they have to live with their host. They can't survive out with being with their host. And what happens with obligate parasites is because they are so closely associated with their host, quite often they get rid of other things, like they stop having their own systems because they don't have to use them because they're inside the host or on the host. And then we've got the kind of other side of the obligate, facultative. So that means they have the facility to be parasites, but they don't have to be parasites. So it means that they could live without the host if they had to. Generally they don't. Generally they're okay. They stay with them. Okay, so here are some examples of some internal parasites and external. It's the tick. Okay, so you could have your tapeworms. Tapeworms have a very limited metabolism. They don't have to, they basically don't have a gut or anything. All they do is absorb the liquid from the kind of liquid in your gut direct through their skin, because you've already done all the hard work and you've done all the digestion. Okay, the plasmodium lives in your bloodstream, it moves into your liver and has a whole kind of life cycle like that. And then we've got the ticks, which are ectoparasites and feed on you on the outside. So not just animals, just remembering that you can have parasitic plants. you can have parasitic fungi, you can have all sorts of organisms, but as I say, any living thing we found, there's at least a dozen parasites that then attack it. So in a similar way to what we had with the crop protection, we're looking here at how they can be transmitted. And these I think are quite obvious. So you can obviously have direct contact, so just a direct movement from one to another. You can have a resistant stage, so that means something that will be released is not actually doing anything at that time, but as soon as it gets to the right condition again, it becomes active. So you can have things like liver fluke, which has a kind of dormant form. And we can also have vectors in the same way that we had with the crop diseases, where you can have a vector just moving them from one place to another. We obviously have vectors inside animals as well. And we also have things called secondary hosts, and a secondary host is where you have a part of a life cycle in a different organism than the one that you produce the next generation in. Okay, more detail on that if you go up to advanced higher. So a simple direct life cycle would just be moving host to host. So basically you just have a simple gets passed on. So this was a whole pile of stuff about Ebola in an attempt to try and keep people doing the right things. I genuinely could have taken this out and put in one about coronavirus, which you obviously should know quite a lot about what you would be trying to do, what are the do's and what are the don'ts. A direct life cycle, you need to find the point at which it moves, and then you need to cut that transmission. If you've got an indirect life cycle, then this is obviously a slightly more complicated one. This is malaria. Okay, so it's actually going from one host, so this is like your blood meal here, okay, which then is doing this inside the mosquito, and then the mosquito goes into a new host, okay, and then in that host we have a cycle that's going on inside the liver and also in the blood, and then finally once it's come through the blood it can be picked up by the next one. So you've got this is a secondary kind of run that's going on. Okay, so crementalism is in a lot of ways actually almost impossible to find, because there's normally some impact, because what we're saying here is that one benefits, the other is unaffected. So this is not something, it's going to shade towards parasitism or mutualism. So those are the two that are in your content statements, but you may see this come up, okay? It would be a plus and a zero. So trying to come up with one, like this could be commensal, and that the barnacles are actually being transported on the body of the whales. The whales are not really that upset about the barnacles, but they are moving them and getting them food. So the barnacles are benefiting, whales are not. But they're not really that upset. Mutualism is where both benefit, okay? So you're going to get a plus plus. So here's a nice wee example. You've got the clownfish and anemones. The clownfish are protected because they're near the anemones that have got stings, and they also the fish will defend the anemones, so you end up with both of them benefit. So to describe mutualism though, there are two additional things that you can say, which are you benefiting by getting a resource, or are you benefiting by getting a service? So in the case of the clownfish and the anemones, that's a service. Both of them are doing a defense service, as it were, okay? You might get a service and a resource. So if you've got flowering plants that are producing, say, edible pollen or nectar, then you've got a resource for the pollinator, but the service is the pollination, okay? And it could both be a resource. So, for example, you have plenty of bacteria in your gut, which are mutualistic bacteria. They are gaining by helping you break down food that you wouldn't otherwise break down, but they're also getting food as well. So both you get food. So the theory of how a eukaryotic cell got its organelles is that you started off with a prokaryote, so you didn't have a nucleus, and then you ended up with folds in the membrane that ended up creating a kind of little pocket that just had all of the chromosomal material. And because that material then was closely packed, it meant that everything that you did there was all now being in the same place. You didn't have to have all of the enzymes that are involved with transcription anywhere else. You just kept them right next to the rest of the stuff you needed. So inside what became the nucleus and eventually enclosed. Next level up of this is that instead of actually just modifying their own membranes, that at some point there were free living prokaryotes themselves that got engulfed and remained inside the cell that engulfed them. So they both started to benefit. So in terms of mitochondria, they were suddenly producing a huge pile of energy that was excess was going to the cell, and the extra cell was now really happy. Okay, and in return for that, those mitochondria were constantly being fed the food they needed. Okay, and they didn't have to move around, they didn't have to forage. So the reason that there's a lot of good evidence for this, we've got two membranes. So the membrane would have been the original membrane and then the kind of pocketed membrane as it pulled it inside. They've got their own DNA, and those DNA are small circular chromosomes, which looks like a prokaryote kind of thinking. So this is how we think that potentially we ended up with the cells, mini cells inside our cells, which are now completely dependent on being inside the cell. Mitochondria would not survive on its own, but also we could not survive without the mitochondria. We have become so completely entangled. Okay, so humans have an impact, not surprisingly, we have an impact on just about everything, on quite a lot of relationships that maybe we didn't realise were essential to have. So one of the ones that is given as a very common example is the bleaching of coral. So coral is actually two organisms that are involved. You've got the coral polyps, and then you have a form of algae that are inside the tubes that are formed by the coral. The algae get security, and they also get waste that is being produced by the polyps, so they're fed by that, and the polyps themselves get the food from the algae. But we are creating all sorts of problems for this. And this is a picture of a healthy coral on the left and a bleached coral on the right. Okay, what's happened is that the colour, which was all coming from the algae, has gone, and that's because these particular algae have a very narrow tolerance curve. And if you remember that back from when we were talking about, well, everything to do with evolution and factors and how things can actually survive. So if you shift the temperature even a little bit, you can move it out with their tolerance range, and then you drop the algae out, and then all you're left with is the coral polyps. And these reefs now that have been created by the polyps are not living anymore. So they just create a kind of loss to the ecosystem. Another really good example of a symbiotic relationship that is definitely mutualistic. On plants, in their roots, what you get round the roots, if this is a root here, you get a whole pile of fungi that grow around that, and those fungi are actually helping absorb water, because basically they're increasing the surface area of the root here. And if you didn't have them there, then the plant couldn't get enough water and minerals. So some of our, our big trees basically are totally dependent on this symbiotic relationship. The fungus basically gets food. It's fed by the plant. Okay. So if we impact in the climate in the other direction, not just about temperature but about water management, we can actually damage this because we damage the fungus and then therefore the larger things like the trees. Okay, and that's us.